Can you imagine the Springboks versus the All Blacks at a 100,000-seater venue in the United States? Well, I'm not talking about a likely 2031 Rugby World Cup final here. I'm talking a 2026 fixture. And in this episode, you are going to get a front row seat to the latest developments surrounding a South Africa-New Zealand rugby test in the United States of America next year. So the two respective rugby unions are cozying up to one another these days. There's a greater and closer cooperation between South Africa and New Zealand. The two unions have agreed to return to old school touring. I think that's wonderful, by the way. I remember as a kid in 1994 waking up at 4 in the morning with a hot chocolate or a hot Milo to watch the Springboks play against teams like Bay of Plenty, Manawatu, and Canterbury. Many times the conditions were really, really bad. I vividly recall images of players drenched in mud, for example. I know the drainage these days is so good, you're unlikely to see that sort of thing in professional rugby these days. But I digress. In 2026, the All Blacks are coming to South Africa. They will face the world champions in 3 tests on our turf. The Kiwis will also take on each of our URC franchises and a SAA side. No talk yet of matches against the Cheetahs, Kings, Pumas or Griquas. And it doesn't look likely either, as the reportedly agreed upon format will be a tour of 8 matches. So that's 3 tests, 4 games against URC franchises, and a SAA game. That SAA game could possibly take place in Bloemfontein, Becha, or Nelspruit, but we'll have to wait and see. Now, we are hearing murmurs of a 4th test being planned between rugby's greatest rivals, and it will take place later in the year in the USA. Now, this will not be part of the 3-match series. So, to be clear, we will play a 3-match series against them in South Africa, and then a one-off test stateside. It's not a 4-match series. The last time something like this happened was in 1996. The Boks hosted a Tri-Nations test against New Zealand in Cape Town, and in the following week began a 3-test series between the two sides. Durban hosted the first, Loftus the second. The New Zealanders, who were able to win both of those matches narrowly, thus became the first All Blacks team in history to win a series on South African soil. I maintain we should never have arranged that series against them. We were at 6s and 7s on the field and in the boardroom at the time. The game had just turned professional, and in typical SAFU fashion, there was chaos. There were massive discrepancies in South African rugby players' salaries. So what happened was one player was on a so-called World Cup contract, and then another player was on a, let's call it a new professional rugby player contract. And what the one was on compared to the other one, it was chalk and cheese. So you can imagine the unhappiness in the camp. Oh, I'm in the team, he's on the bench, or he's not even in the squad, and he's earning 3 times what I'm earning, or whatever it was. So people were not happy, as you can imagine. Also, we hadn't prepared properly before the Tri-Nations. So before that, at that stage, new competition started, we just got caught with our pants down. New Zealand and Australia arranged 3 test matches, which today we call it the incoming tour or the July tests. In those days, the June test matches. They played matches in June, 3. We hastily arranged 1 test about 10 days before the first one against Australia, against Fiji at Loftus in Pretoria. And yes, we won it and we got a little bit of gameplay out of it, but the boys were not prepared. We should have had 3 against Fiji, or 1 against them, 1 against Samoa, 1 against Tonga, whatever the case may be. We should have had 3 in June instead of just the 1 10 days before we flew out to take on the Wallabies in Sydney. So yes, we got caught with our pants down. Then we also had a new coach, Andre Markgraaff, who wanted to change too much too quickly. He isolated a lot of our 1995 heroes and brought in, admittedly, great players, but the core of the side was disrupted. The players would only truly get on the end of year tour in 1996. And part of that came about because Mark Groff had finally stamped his authority on the team by dropping captain Francois Pienaar. The ingredients were there for a New Zealand victory. Now look, fair play to them. They still had to come here and win. I just think we made it unnecessarily easier for them than what it should have been. And that's where my frustration stems from. Anyway, I take great comfort knowing Ireland and Australia have won a series in New Zealand, but those two have never won a series in South Africa. Anyway, so how do we get here? Well, of course, it's all about the money. Both unions are cash-strapped, or at least relatively cash-strapped. And a big money-spinning test in America would do wonders for the coffers. That said, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a Springbok supporter or an All Blacks fan who is not already excited about this. Now, there's also talk that this game could possibly be played in London instead of the States. Personally, I'm all in favour of playing the test in the USA. We've played at Twickenham so many times before. Obviously, many times against England, but also recently, neutral matches, so to speak. We hammered the All Blacks there in the Qatar Airways Cup match before the 2023 Rugby World Cup, for example. We then smashed Wales there last year, also for the Qatar Airways Cup. We're going to be playing Argentina at Twickenham in London. Granted, it's their home game, but we will be there against an opponent other than England this year. Now, yes, we could have also decided, and again, it's not confirmed, so outside of Twickenham, we could also play at the Olympic Stadium, or the London Stadium as they call it. That's the one, if you're a football fan, where West Ham United play their matches. It's also the venue that hosted the Athletics during the 2012 Olympic Games. We could even play at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. That's the newest one. It's a magnificent venue. But I just think, given the United States of America hosting the 2031 Rugby World Cup, they could do with the event more than the UK. I wonder where in the USA it might be played. Soldier Field in Chicago readily springs to mind. New Zealand played there against the Eagles in 2014, or played, I beg your pardon. Then they faced Ireland there in 2016, a win for the Irish. The two play there again next year, interestingly enough. The All Blacks also played Fiji last year in San Diego. So the New Zealanders clearly have good relations with the Yanks and can help make the test happen that side. I'd prefer an East Coast time zone game for our own TV time, so New York, Boston, Miami, or even Atlanta. Washington, D.C. comes to mind. Remember, in 2018, when Dr. Erasmus took over the reins, his first test in charge was actually in D.C. against Wales, although, granted, both teams put out so-called second-string sides. I know that Pieter-Steph du Toit was our captain that day, and you'd hardly describe him as a second stringer, but it wasn't our full-strength 15 or match day 23 that Rassie was able to put out that day, because it was outside of the test window. Philadelphia and Chicago also come to mind, even though they're not exactly East Coast, but I think that they would be fine by my estimation. But let's see what happens. I think that Chicago maybe is just not the way to go, because that's kind of like an All Blacks home ground these days, given that they've played there so many times now over the years. So maybe New York or Miami, Boston, any of those might be better. Either way, there's clearly a warming of relations between South Africa and New Zealand's rugby bosses. Things were frosty for a while. After the Super Rugby breakup during COVID, SA Rugby took its franchises to the Northern Hemisphere, and the URC was born. Many people now feel that the New Zealand players are missing out on the regular ultra-physical encounters against South African franchises in Super Rugby. This is to their detriment. We are unaffected by it. And from that point of view, I think it's great. I hope we never return to Super Rugby. The competition was so heavily skewed in favour of the New Zealand franchises in any event. For example, they would typically never have to come to Africa for more than 3 weeks. our teams would have to go that side for at least 4 weeks, sometimes longer. And then, when the tournament expanded to include a Japanese team, we found ourselves taking 2 trips to the other side of the world. Now, if you're not sure why that's a problem, well, we're talking traveling across multiple time zones here. And when you travel east, it's a lot more difficult than when you travel west, because it just completely throws your body clock out. You know, you think that it's 10 in the morning, and yet it's 10 in the evening. And now you're supposed to be sleeping, but how are you supposed to sleep? Because your body thinks it's 10 in the morning, even though you look outside, it's clearly not. You see how this becomes a problem. Whereas when you go in the other direction, your body thinks it's 10 p.m., but it's actually 10 a.m. Just watch a movie, watch 2 movies, and inverted commas, stay up late. And then it's easy to catch up the difference, as opposed to going in the other direction. I mean, the furthest I've ever gone east, because I haven't been down under, the furthest I've ever gone east was Thailand. And that was, I think, a 5-hour difference. And that threw me. Like, I struggled. My wife struggled as well. We were sleeping in the middle of the afternoon because we just couldn't keep our eyes open anymore. So you see how it becomes a problem. Now, throw in the fact that you're supposed to play rugby matches, important rugby matches. So since we are the ones who have to go east, you can see why our teams were at a significant disadvantage. The same is true of the Rugby Championship and the old Tri-Nations. I thought it was total BS that 75% of the time the All Blacks started at home, and we had to start the tournament down under. How come it didn't rotate fairly? Honestly, I think the Rugby Championship is a competition that is on life support. Consider this. In Rugby World Cup years, it's already a shortened tournament with teams only playing each other once. In 2026 and every 4 years thereafter, it's going to be a similar story because of the tours between South Africa and New Zealand. You now also have the new Nations Championship coming next year, and that's expected to take place every 2 years. The Springboks and All Blacks are likely going to be required to play Fiji and Japan in those years. So when exactly is there going to be time to play an additional fixture against the Wallabies and Los Pumas? So now you can see a scenario where in 3 of the 4 years in a Rugby World Cup cycle, the Rugby Championship is going to be reduced to a single round. I see that competition dying, guys. And in its stead, I hope that we see the Aussies and Argentines also touring home and away against South Africa and New Zealand every few years. I think it'll be great. And we know the fans long for these old school tours. Right now, as a South African rugby fan, we only see them every 12 years when the British and Irish Lions visit. I think a few more would be great. How about you? How excited are you about the Springboks hosting the All Blacks next year for a full tour? Let me know in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, you might want to consider a super thanks comment. If you have a look down there, you'll see there's a heart button with a $sign inside of it. And if you click on that, it'll give you the opportunity to make a highlighted comment. I promise to click on the heart button. I will also reply to your comment, and you will be given the opportunity to make a small donation to my channel. And the reason I'm looking for small donations, guys, is because I would love to do this full time, and we can do it by making it fan-funded. Also, I would love to visit the Rugby World Cup in 2027 and provide you with daily coverage from down under. And you can help me make that happen by giving me a super thanks. It starts from as little as $1. That's US dollars, not Zim dollars. I know the Rand is not what it once was, but $1 is where it starts. If you want to give me $100 million, feel free to do so, especially if your surname happens to be Rupert or Oppenheimer or Motsepe. If you're not yet ready to support me in that manner, you can also just click on the like button down there. In fact, you know what? Why don't you spear tackle the like button while you're down there? And you can also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so. Now, I mentioned the 2027 Rugby World Cup in Australia. Well, let's talk about the 2023 World Cup, the one that we won most recently in France. A few months ago, I did a video talking about the World Cup final 1 year later, and it stirred up all kinds of emotions, remembering that wonderful occasion. If you'd like to take a trip down memory lane with me, you can watch that video. It's on your screen over here. And if you want to go even further down memory lane, I have a fascinating interview I did with Springbok team manager Zola Yeye about the 2007 Rugby World Cup. He was manager and he had to deal with several issues, including the France stain biting disciplinary matter, issues about whether or not he was qualified to do the job. Spoiler alert, he was overqualified for the job. And he also shares an incredible story about how President Thabo Mbeki wanted to discipline the Springboks after they had won the tournament. Find out everything that he had to say. I promise it's an incredible discussion. You can watch that one over here, and I will speak to you next time.